we have one final pair. We need microphone. So for the final pair this afternoon, I'm pleased to introduce first Amber Musser, who will be talking to us about the ascription of agency to things. And Amber is an assistant professor of women, gender, and sexuality studies at Washington University in St. Louis. So, Amber, turn over to you.
All right. So this will probably be under the 10 minutes because my brain is totally fried. And all of my plans to ad-lib are might be going out the window. But I sort of want to echo, I think, what a few of us on this the session about the cognition have started to say, which is basically, I don't really do history. I'm not totally sure what is, I feel a little askew to many of the participants in the volume, but listening to a lot of these presentations and abstracts, I feel like there are different sorts of connections that I think I can make, but I'm sort of curious to hear feedback from you guys. So I want to say that I primarily work in queer theory, which is to say that I am often in the realm of intangible things, but I'm interested in thinking about objects as technologies of gender. So this project is sort of, I'm trying to attach it to a new project that I'm working on, which looks at femininity as it's incarnated into 3 different archetypal objects: the mother, the lesbian, and the diva. Right? So you'll notice that these are kind of more psychoanalytic objects than the type of objects that we've been talking about. But what I'm interested in is the way that these objects in turn represent different forms of objectification and are each produced through different material objects. So a lot of what I'm trying to do is look at these kind of cultural objects and pull out the materiality from them, because I'm also really interested in embodiment. So it's sort of how we can find the material within sort of these other types of questions. So my work that I'm talking about today is on the punk and the dandy, and they're related actually to my questions about the diva, which produces femininity as a form of spectacularity. So sort of in the chapter that's produced, I hope to tease out the relationship between the spectacular and unstable performances of masculinity by the punk and the dandy, and the very basic technologies of the safety pin and straight pin. So first I became interested in the dandy, and this actually grew out of the exhibit that the Rhode Island Museum of Design, School of Design had last spring, sort of from March to August, that was about the dandy. And these are images from the museum. They kind of collected different, it wasn't a chronological exhibit, it was sort of different instantiations of dandyism around the globe, sort of from Regency England onward, along with different objects that kind of relate to the dandy. So I became interested in the way that the RISD Museum kind of produced this idea of the dandy for several reasons. So one, the idea that the history of the dandy is a form of masculinity that, as Charles Baudelaire says, has no profession other than elegance, right? So already we're sort of in the mode of spectacularity and thinking about that. That the idea of chronology or one's embeddedness in a particular historical milieu is less important than the spectacular nature of one's wardrobe, right? So it's sort of, I'm also interested in the way that these dandies are kind of always out of time, right? That these are images from now, except that you'll note that there's not really any marker of 2014, 2013, like they're very sort of their own kind of thing. So the exhibit then is not committed to preserving the idea. So in that way, the exhibit and kind of the idea of the dandy itself is not committed to committed to preserving the idea of the dandy, which Baudelaire also knows as a melancholic relic of the past. But it's also really invested in thinking about how that spirit might continue onward. So the key here is that the idea that they've formulated the dandy in terms of a shift towards rebellion and artistry. So Baudelaire's dandies were iconoclasts, but dandyism is, quote, a setting sun, feudal resistance to the oncoming threat of democracy or normalization. think of Anne here. But in contrast, the RISD exhibit understands dandyism to be a vibrant rebuke against the norm, where personality and individualism reign supreme, right? And so sort of here's another kind of set of images from the exhibit. This is also my first time with PowerPoint, so it's going to be a little light with images because I did not know how to do them. But in some ways, we could argue that this move towards sort of thinking about the dandy as personality, and I sort of put these two images together because here we sort of see, I mean, we're supposed to focus on this man's elegance, but the fact that his elegance is about sort of showing him to be a very particular type of individual, right? And one that sort of goes against what the norms of 2013, 2014 are, right? So we could argue that this move highlights the gender normativity of the dandy, and it does this by equating agency, which we sort of understand in this sort of 2014 form, which is sort of another one of my arguments is that sort of, which I'll talk about when I talk about this in comparison with the other exhibit, but that this sort of ideals of masculinity that are at work in these museum curations of masculinity are about a particular type of neoliberal agency, which has to do about agencies through consumption and sort of through a particular type of display, right? So it does this by equating agency with the spectacular gender performance. And importantly, this undercuts previous readings of the dandy as frivolous and narcissistic, qualities that are more commonly and sort of damningly associated with femininity. So this idea is producing kind of a norm of masculine spectacularity. And I think a lot of what's interesting about the way this exhibit does that is it does it not by sort of, it shows us these images of the dandies, but it does it by focusing on the material culture, right? So this is why you see the picture of the man, but you also see the coat. And then sort of in this other vision, this is another still from the exhibit, much of it is photographs and then actual clothes on hangers, right? So here I'm interested both in what we see and what we don't see. So details such as pleats, folds, perfectly lined up seaming, and sort of in contrast, what we don't, which is the tailor and the straight pin. So the tailor helps to enact the vision that their patients proffer, and they do so with a particular set of tools at their disposal. Their ability to drape, to pin, to cut. The secret of the dandy, then, is his relationship to the pin and how well another man can make the pin speak to and for him. So thinking of the tailors brings us into another place that I'm not sure will be fruitful for this essay, but I'll mention it here, right? The tailors are participants in the drama of dandyism, but their labor is read as an extension of their patrons' desires. The seamlessness of this allows us to consider these men technologies of masculinity. So I use this phrase to highlight the labor involved, its invisibility, and the opacity of their affect. In describing the invisibility of technicians, Stephen Shapin writes, "Technicians' works was transparent when the apparatus was working as it should, and the results were as they ought to be." So this is one place where class, gender, and race come to the fore. It's not difficult to read their invisibility as emblematic of their lack of institutional and societal power. This is not really the focus of my research, but more needs to be done on that. So the straight pin, as the tailor's prime tool, does a tremendous amount of work here in that it conceals the tailor's efforts while also signaling his presence. It is impossible to produce fit, which is one of the modes that the dandy occupies spectacular masculinity, right? Because his costume is supposed to fit perfectly and sort of be tailored, be made for him. His costume is imagined to be a seamless presentation of his individuality. That cannot happen with lumps, sagging, or bagginess. So without the straight pin, this masquerade is impossible. And it's likewise impossible to use these objects alone. I don't know how many of you have tried to sew, but you cannot use the straight pin on your, it just doesn't work, right? You need, somebody else needs to be there to help you pin it, or you create a dummy of your body. But either way, there's sort of it's about kind of proximity of two bodies, either two real bodies or sort of a live body and another body. So right there, we already have some kind of instability in the dandy's understanding of masculinity when we look more closely at the technology that enables him, which again, I'm sort of focusing on the pin. So I'm pairing this in this essay with the punk, which I came to from the Metropolitan Museum of Art's 2013 exhibit on the punk, From Chaos to Couture, which was sort of staged by the Costume Institute. So in a lot of ways, I paired these exhibits both because I think they're speaking to different ideas about what we imagine contemporary masculinity to be and sort of the types of values that it has, but also because they actually start and end in the same place. They both end, and I don't have a picture of him, but with Malcolm McLaren. And I thought that was a really interesting idea, and in part it speaks to the type of dandyism that the RISD exhibit is proffering, which is sort of dandyism as an affront to normativity. And so the punk exhibit picks up where the dandy exhibit ends, right? In that it focuses on an ethos of revolt through consumerism. So this exhibit brings together punk fashion with some well-known fashion designers who borrow from that exhibit. So while the Met exhibit is not focused on defining who or what punk is, they focus mainly on discussing the ways that it can and has been commodified. So you can sort of see here, there's sort of a picture from the 70s with Sid Vicious, and there's kind of the, I don't remember which designer it is, but there's sort of like the designer version of the punk exhibit, right? So what they're actually working to do in that way is showing the continuities between the punk and the dandy. So central to this exhibit is actually the safety pin as emblematic of punk's peculiarity, right? So here the pins work not to offer a seamless presentation of masculinity, but they work instead to offer punk to the masses. In contrast to the invisibility of the straight pin, I might have another image here, but I'm not totally sure. No, okay. I'll focus on that again, sorry. So in contrast to the invisibility of the straight pin, the safety pin beckons users and suggests amateurism and mass production rather than expertise. The point of these safety pins is to demonstrate excess, to show the labor of the creator and to emphasize the idea that the wearer could have been the producer. In punk's original system of meaning-making, this style of altering clothing was meant to be an affront to systems of gender and class. The original punks used them as emblems of gender nonconformity, highlighting the visibility of tailoring as feminine work, and revolt against the prevailing norms for laboring in masculinity. So in the Met exhibit, the safety pin works to connote danger and masculinity by showing precisely where and how clothing can be altered and remain clothing. There's also something that happens when the safety pin becomes the tool of the designer expert and not about the personality of the wearer. These self-made men, most of the designers in the exhibit are men, are fashioning women. So there's also a spectacular masculinity at work, but interestingly, it's not the masculinity of the wearer, but of the producer, right? And so it also appears under the guise of individuality and personality, though the external dynamics differ. So sort of just as a very brief concluding, so I've set up two primary actors for this essay, and I'm interested in what happens when we reinvigorate the context that these performances of masculinity arose from. So part of this story is an ethos of a colorblind 2013 vision of masculinity, where everyone, everywhere can be a self-made man, where spectacularity and masculinity are valorized and caught up in a rubric of agency, superficial rebellion, and consumption. But I'm also interested in how we can think through the agency of the straight pin and safety pin as objects that occupy their own epistemological milieux, to sort of disrupt that narrative and bring back attention to the racialized context where punk and dandyism emerged and still thrive. So that's sort of where I'll end. Thank you.
Thank you, Amber. And so now our final presentation today is actually a jointly authored effort. We have one of the authors here with us. I'd like to introduce Lambros Malafouris, who's a research fellow in creativity and a tutor in archaeology, anthropology, and human evolution from Keble College, University of Oxford. And his collaborator, Chris Godston, the professor of European archaeology at the University of Oxford, is not here. But I'd like to turn it over to you.
Thank you very much,
Lambros,
and
thank you.
Thank you for your kind invitation. As the last paper of the discussion tonight, I'll try to be brief and hopefully simple, although the issues that I will try to communicate are somehow extremely complicated in many, many ways. The paper and the chapter that I'm working with Chris is focusing on two things primarily. The one has to do with the interaction between cognition and material culture, and how, in what sense, the one might help us understand the other, or in some sense allow us to develop a new understanding about human thinking and about the role that things, materiality, material culture, I mean, those terms I'm not quite sure how we define them. So when I'm referring to material culture, I mean things, I mean materials, I mean material structures, I mean objects. So I'm not making any aspiration, at least for our discussion tonight. So the key terms that you see, the title would be material engagement, which is a kind of theoretical approach I've been developing for some years now, with Colin Remhue initially in Cambridge and now with Chris in Oxford. And it's a term that I'm using to describe certain things that traditionally are being treated as separate. So I found very unhelpful to think about mind as something separate from the body and separate from material culture. So I don't believe in those separation. I think it's the three together in action that give us what we call thinking in the world, in a situated action in specific context. And material engagement is my way, and I will describe what are the main postulates of this approach to deal with this phenomenon. Now, the second term, plasticity, I find plasticity a very useful term, and Henry also referred to this previously. Obviously, it derives from neuroscience, and we could begin thinking about plasticity by way of neuroplasticity, but I also believe that the notion can be extended in very interesting and useful ways in the outside environment. So I do think that we might be able to speak about extra neuroplasticity, and most importantly, we maybe can use materiality to think as a possible bridge between neural and cultural plasticity. So, and I have the notion of metaplasticity to describe this possible interaction of two systems that are constantly in ongoing change and interaction. So we have a plastic mind that is always embedded in a plastic culture, and the two together enables us to develop the ways of thinking and action that we have. And this brings us to the third concept, which is the developmental challenge, and by that I simply mean, how can we understand the process of human growth, transformation, and change, what we may call the human becoming. And I use the term becoming because I think it's useful in the sense that it makes us think about a process, an ongoing process, and it also escapes some of the problems that some of the thinking by way of Darwinian evolution or thinking by way of development itself might have, as it's been developed from other disciplines and fields of research. So far I have avoided to use the words mind, material, culture, and evolution. The reason I have avoided is because I will be using material engagement theory to rethink the meaning of those terms and how we might be able to define them in a more useful way in terms of our discussion about material culture. So let me say, okay, a few things about what I call the material engagement approach. The material engagement approach is essentially it concerns primarily about two things: the interaction between cognition and material culture, and the effect and an effect of that interaction to the ways we think. And what might be useful to think about this diagram is that don't think about cognition as an entity and material culture as an entity, and by interacting those two entities gives us ways of thinking. You have to think that all three aspects of this relationship emerge in the process of activity. So what the kind of thinking and the kind of object or thing will be an emerging product of the interaction between the two. So it is not before the process. And of course all those things happen in time, so you have this long-term and evolutionary or comparative element at the same time. And time is really, really an important dimension in all this. So, and I think that John's paper in the morning illustrated certain important dimensions of this aspect. And I do think that time is key in terms of how we think and how we conceptualize this interaction between minds and things. So if I am to state very briefly the main underlying assumption of this approach, that would be to recast the boundaries of the mind and redress the balance of the cognitive equation by bringing materiality, that is the world of things, artifacts, objects, materials, and material science into the cognitive fold. And I take that statement quite seriously. So it's not a metaphor. I'm trying to use it as a way of redefining how we think and how we study human cognition, broadly speaking. And I think it's quite useful also to consider the implications of such a statement for our understanding of materiality and material culture. So what I call material engagement theory has three main postulates or working hypotheses. The first one is the extended mind, and this refers to a broad conceptualization that is emerging nowadays in cognitive science in terms of how we make sense of the mind as something that extends beyond skin and skull. So it's the sense that we have nowadays, and that comes from many, many different directions, is that this idea that we have about thinking about cognition as a product of the human brain, something that happens inside our head, is not at all the case. And ideas about embodied cognition and distributed cognition and active thinking, all those things that show us that mind is actually more action-like, more mediated and embodied than we traditionally assume, are playing an important role nowadays. So my view of extended mind theory would be one that states that things are co-substantial, continuous, and coextensive parts of minds in action. And recognizably, that's a quite radical statement and can be criticized and has been criticized by several philosophers as conflating or confusing causality with constitution, meaning that, yes, of course, we can all recognize that things influence or has a causal effect on how we think, but I mean, how and on what basis can we go as far as to claim that they are actually parts, they have a constitutive role in the ways we think. But I want to clarify that this is the statement that I'm making. I'm arguing for the constitutivity of material culture. So it's not just an influence, it's something more than that. It's actually part of the thinking process. So that's about the extended mind. An active sign. The inactive sign, what I call it inactive signification, is my way of dealing with the problem that Henry described before. And he used this term, which I found very, very interesting, sensiotics, exactly, to illustrate the sensory aspect of meaning making. So basically, an active signification is more or less the same thing, but I'm focusing on the inactive character of human action. And the key element about this is this idea of bringing forth rather than representing the signifiers of a signified. By that I mean it's a movement beyond representation. Symbols are traditionally being defined as something that represents something else in a given context. I think that the most interesting aspect of the semiotic procedure is not representational, is inactive, is experiential, and that's what I'm trying to argue with the inactive sign, which is actually in my way of dealing with the material sign. And the last hypothesis would be the material agency, which is close to what we've been discussing late in the last part of our conversation. And basically, material agency is a way of dealing with the causal efficacy of things in human thought and action. And in some sense, material agency is a misnomer, an intentional misnomer I use to emphasize the fact that although usually people have no problem to use the term human agent to refer to humans as actors, I mean, many papers refer to the work by way of actor network theory and Brula too, which pretty much making similar claims by way of agency and things. When we think in a serious way about objects as agents, we don't really feel that something must be wrong there. The reason we feel that is because very often we confuse agency with sense of agency, meaning consciousness of agency, or with intentionality. Agency is not necessarily about intentionality, and it's not necessarily about awareness of agency. It's about causality by way of doing. So if you have an active role in a doing, if you are responsible for something to happen, then you can be named an agent. And I think very often a lot of things that we do by way of materiality have that kind of effect on us, meaning that the notion that best described that would come out of ecological psychology and would be the notion of affordance. Affordance describes the possibility, the interactive possibilities that a given object might have on us. So if I'm facing this glass and I'm thirsty, I probably will grasp it and use it. And that is not happening just because I intend so. It is happening because this plastic object affords this kind of activity. The two together enable me to become an agent, but agency actually is the emergent property of our interaction. So those are the three main postulates that we will be focusing in this chapter, and the last part of the chapter will be to try and see how those three working hypotheses might change some of the prevalent understanding of Darwinian evolution, especially by way of neo-Darwinian frameworks of thinking about long-term change and evolution in terms of material culture. But yes, I'll stop now here, and you let me know if any questions. Thank you.
Thank you. So I'd like to open up the floor now for questions for Amber.
Well, actually, it's for both of you. I'm wondering how the critique of neo-Darwinianism, which you didn't quite expand, fits with your argument about biological selection. So you're talking to each other on that.
Yes, well, I've been thinking about that. I'm not entirely, by listening how you describe your case, although I can see how a vocabulary of selection and adaptation and functionalism maybe can be conceived as part of this neo-Darwinian thinking. You mentioned here, you put a lot of emphasis on niche construction. And niche construction is actually a reaction to neo-Darwinism in some way. So this model we have by way of niche construction theory actually comes as a nice way to bring together this ability that we have as humans to alter the environment, which in turn will change us. And you get this ongoing process of coevolution in an interesting way, because there is also an unhelpful way to think about coevolution, and it is more, maybe the more orthodox, if you would, way, but it is the one that recognizes a process of biological evolution and a process of cultural evolution. And what we do is we take the main, what we know, the properties of biological evolution, and we project them to the domain of culture to explain that. And that's not the case, so far as I think about the evolutionary process, because I think that there is far more interaction between the two to be able to separate them in such a way. So I think that what happens at the level of culture changes what happens at the level of biology. And to keep the two separate is not helpful at all as a way of understanding evolution. And that's why I'm focusing more on developmental frameworks of thinking about life and development rather than so maybe it's for you to elaborate a little more in terms of how you situate yourself by your misconstruction.
And I don't mean to turn this back into talking about my paper now, because I think we should focus on yours, but it seems to me that the kind of account that I want to construct here doesn't depend on any strict separation between the biological and the cultural. And the niche, and it's a developmental account that takes selective pressure and adaptation seriously, but also I really want to think about niche construction and development within niche as like the model. So I was, as I was talking about like the fork and its interaction with us and how we change and change it in response, and these things sort of develop together. I mean, that's the kind of thing that I had in mind. And I'm curious to know, as you were describing this, that thinking about the fork, say, for instance, and the extended mind thesis that you're interested in there, how, like, the role of something like proprioception in the development of certain artifacts, but the role that that plays and how that sort of supports this extended mind thesis in your larger picture. So so the kinds of know-how that people have brought up with regard to our use of and interaction with the material world that are pretty reflective and, not in any sense like occurrently cognitive.
Yeah.
That those, but often involve this proprioceptive sense, which some people take to be the kind of paradigmatic sense of extended mind.
Well, in some sense, yes, that's a basic way to think about extended mind, and especially if you identify extended mind by embodied cognition, what we call embodiment, and that basically means that the body is part of your thinking. Not in an epiphenomenal way, but in a really direct way. I mean, it clearly shapes the way you think. The problem I'm having with embodied mind theory is that very often they stop with the body, as if materiality is not existing.
Oh, I see.
And I'm saying that there is nothing, I mean, most of the things you do with your body are also mediated and extended with some sort of material environment. I mean, action, in most of the cases, is mediated action. So I cannot really see how, if you are to go and accept embodiment and accept embodied mind as a new way to conceptualize cognition, you might stop at the body. You have to extend to the environment. I imagine the problem that philosophy of mind is having with these notions is that they mind the school of behaviorism. I mean, what I mean by that is cognitive science originated as a reaction and criticism against behaviorism. Behaviorism was that school of thinking about mind, was saying that, basically it's just behavior. We cannot really observe anything by way of what happens inside the head. So let's focus on behavior. And what we call mind is behavior. And then when we have the birth of cognitive science by way of developing the computer, and the computer as a technology was a main actor in shaping the way we think and define human cognition nowadays, which is strictly computational, and the dominant framework remains computational. We think of the mind as a computer. We think that there is some kind of input in our brain which is represented somehow, either in neural or some other algorithmic form, and is processed internally, and then you have some sort of output. And that's, strictly speaking, a computational procedure which comes out of the computer as an output. And because then you have also a nice model to test these ideas by way of the computer itself, then it gains strength. So 60s, 70s, and 80s were defined by this computational understanding of cognition. And I don't think that this is the best way to think about cognition. I think it's a historical way to think about cognition. It's a product of what happened in the last 3 decades, maybe. And also a good example of how technology, how the environment, how materiality can shape how we think and very often define, particularly back to things that we don't know and use them to understand them.
I have to say we have so many hands right now, which is wonderful. So why don't we start Peter, and then Neil, and then Ellen, and then We have 5 others, I think. So I'm going to start there, and then we'll keep going. We'll start with those 3 and then continue.
Okay, turning from the theoretical to the material, I had a problem with your interpretation of the safety pin. That is, right or wrongly, I mean, when the punk movement started, I assumed that the safety pin was a statement of anti-fashion. It's something that should be hidden and they display it. It's a bit like Richard Rogers putting the pipes on the surface of the Centre Pompidou, and that punk was an anti-fashion which turned into a fashion. Now, of course, we're doing history here, so we ought to document this. And how on earth could one? I've never tried. I suppose one would have to interview punks. I imagine that punks were, at least in their heyday, rather resistant to interview. I have a lot of pleasure from giving you a completely wrong answer. But maybe retired punks, ex-punks, now that the question of recalling their youth might give you a straight answer, which will enable some to get the record straight.
We have at least one in the house.
Yes.
Do you want to know?
Do you have more to say about the safety thing?
Oh my gosh, so I was a teenager in LA in the 80s, very into punk rock, and there was a thriving punk scene in Los Angeles at that time. And I had lots of safety pins on my clothes, and you're absolutely right. It was, I don't care, my clothes are falling apart, and I'm just going to pin it on, except that secretly sometimes I rip them myself. But it was supposed to be anti-fashion.
Yeah.
I'm not going to buy new clothes.
But that was, I didn't mean to convey that it wasn't. I mean, that was, I think one of the interesting things is when you look more, that's the point of punk, but the safety pin also has these other potential layers. But I absolutely agree that the point of punk, not in the Met exhibit, but the point of punk general is precisely to sort of expose, to be anti-fashion, but also to sort of, I would say, expose the scenes of what's going on in the fashion, not only fashion record.
Neil, did you want to jump in?
Yeah, I'm horrible feeling I'm suffering from it being 11 p.m. and I'm getting out of it. Now, just there's a whole load of things seem to be coming out terribly coherently, actually, and there's that question about safety pin and meaning. One of the things there is, what, back to this functionalist question, why you said you were doing it is actually why were you doing it? There's that question hanging, and then we're talking about this is slightly sidestepping the embodiment thing, and that's back to the whole problem of Cartesian dualities and the idea, in fact, of the individual person, that being a meaningful unit of study at all. And I find that's tremendously refreshing that we can break away from that. But that is very challenging and very unsettling for everybody. And that takes me to my sort of final random point, actually goes back to your paper. It took me a while to get my mind together, is actually the difficulty we have with meaninglessness and how desperately people want to ascribe meaning somewhere. Now, talking about natural selection has become very seductive because it gives meaning and gives intentionality. And yet, there is a genuine question, why are polar bears white? If you ask people to say it's because they've evolved to meet their environment, we don't know that. We don't know why they're white. It may be some other reason altogether. It may be utterly inadvertent. It may be some other selection going on. And indeed, most mutations are harmless, irrelevant. They may have an effect on the phenotype, but they don't really have. There's no selection for them. It's just drift. So I think all these things, to my mind just now, are coming back to this sort of reveling in uncertainty and lack of meaning. And I think that's actually one of the things I'm getting so far, is actually how important meaninglessness is in all these things. Sorry, it's probably an 11 o'clock talk. But
David, if you want to address that?
No, I think that's a very good point, actually. And I think that a lot of the problems are, if you think about it, a lot of the things that people are doing by way of material culture are meaningful in a more direct sense, and they become hugely problematic when you try to reduce them by way of categories that usually come from all disciplines. in the development of the disciplines. And that's my understanding of it. When I first was trying to make sense of human cognition by just looking at materiality, I found that the notions as those have been developed from other people with other questions and problems in mind were not very helpful in terms of discussing and dealing with those issues. It happens, however, that the last 2 decades at least, there is a whole new discussion and a whole new trend in cognitive science that is very, very close to the kind of problematic and the kind of questions that we've been discussing and the material cognitive studies have been discussing for the last 20 years. So I can see a kind of merging of perspective that I'm hoping will provide the space for meaningful dialogue about meaningless.
Amber, did you want to ask that? So Ellen?
Yeah, I just was thinking, I think John earlier raised the question of whether bodies could be material culture, and it seems like Amber's work is suggesting that they are. After all, you're saying that dandyism is a kind of manifestation of the personality, but also of the body, of a flat-planed, live, particular style of body that has to be produced first in order to fit those clothes that then can be fitted. I mean, you didn't show any fat dandies as far as I noticed, but perhaps they were in the exhibit. I don't, that's not part of the general idea of them. So that question of that interaction between the object, between the material, the clothing and the body to suit it is, I mean, the clothes suit the body, but the body has to fit the clothing. So I wonder if you want to say more about that. And I also had a final observation on safety pins, which not only having seen them used as earrings by punk folk, but also, and nose pins as well, but also wondering, that's right around the time that disposable diapers come in. So they safety pins stop being an icon of diapering, which is what they were earlier, most closely associated with it. And then they're available for this other use as well. So.
Yeah, that's really, it's interesting because actually when Rebecca was giving her paper and she had the incident about, the Betsy Wetsy doll and the straight pin, suddenly I was like, oh, there's this whole other thing that I haven't been thinking of at all. So I'm happy to hear you bring that up because I think you're absolutely right that it changes the culture of danger around the pin and sort of like the world that's coming into. And in terms of thinking about the ways that these bodies are produced, I mean, one of the things that I haven't had time to get into as yet, but I hope to, is sort of by looking at the racialized spaces in which they emerge, I think the technologies of body become even more apparent. Because sort of the racialized history of the dandy, especially sort of with regards to black masculinity, is really interesting because it's sort of a very particular type of spectacular elegance, which I think you're absolutely right. Like it goes into a particular type of body that is about display rather than work, right? So it's a very different type of black masculinity. So thinking about that with regard to what it means for clothing is something I'd like to explore more. But I don't currently have more to say about it. But it's interesting how the punk doesn't have that, right? Like the dandy is sort of, I'm thinking of this like envelope body, whereas like punk has a different. It's a different technology of gender happening there.
It could be a very muscular built punk?
Yeah, you can have any type of body. It's less.
Yes.
It's nice. I had something about the straight pin, just to comment that early modernists got very excited about the pin and clothes. And something that you might want to do to kind of go back to the early modern history, that is that these women, like the image we saw before, I suppose it comes out, I can't remember what it was, but those clothing would not want to clothes was actually entirely pinned out. So this is actually very different from Tailor. Because Tailor to put the pins in and do so. Actually, all those early modern bodies are totally pinned out, and they're hidden. And to see that, there's the British galleries in the V&A, when John Stiles redesigned those galleries, he's actually got his 17th century portrait with a whole line of pins at the bottom. So kind of playing up what this is a construction, and partly by pins.
Well, I think we have time right now for maybe one more question. Does anyone else? Laura. Okay, Laura.
Just building on that, that's exactly what I was going to bring up, was the notion of being pinned into one's clothing. And juxtaposing that with the concept of tailoring, where you're trying to take a flat, two-dimensional piece of material and then fit it to a curved body. That pins were used to put people into clothes and keep them in clothes, often for days at a time, and that they were an absolutely vital part of dressing the body for men, women, and children.
Well, why did they, for those of us who don't know anything about the history of fashions, why did they pin the clothes together?
Because, good question, you had two choices. You could either pin them in or sew them in. And so pinning allowed some movement of clothing, but the modern fasteners were developing over time. So pins were one of the best ways to get people in and out of clothing and fit it to the body best as best you could. But that's a really great question, how the development of fastening technology has changed over time.
And it's also the preciousness of the material, you could reuse it more easily, so the maintenance of it is much less as well.
Easier,
Because you want to keep reusing all that cloth. So
the most expensive thing you're putting in your household in most cases.
The other thing to be aware of is that tailors and milliners often work very differently, because tailors tended to work off of measures and milliners often cut things out while sewn to corsets or stays, as they were more properly known. So you ended up with very different approaches to how you fit clothes to bodies.
Well, I want us to thank Amber and others. Final prayer.